The Marching Roundtable is proud to be an official media partner of Drum Corps International.
Thanks for coming to the Marching Roundtable YouTube channel, sharing great information to help you succeed in all the marching arts. While you're here, we hope you'll subscribe. Hi, this is Tim Hinton, the Beast of the Marching Arts and the host of the Marching Roundtable podcast. On this series, we talk with a private lesson teacher and performer for each instrument to tell you what you need to know to be more effective in working with those students. We hope you enjoy the series.
So whatever mouthpiece you have, and obviously we're going to start off with a classical mouthpiece, the generic mouthpiece that's in the case, or a Selmer C-Star, whatever we end up playing for classical or concert band setting. We're going to make sure that that mouthpiece is not chipped or broken. And so I can't tell you how many times I will have students come to me and they'll be like, oh, I noticed this little chip in the mouthpiece. Is this going to impact or affect my playing? Yes, it will. And so we want to make sure that that mouthpiece is in great condition. That mouthpiece is clean. So we want to make sure that it's been sanitized, particularly if somebody else had been using that instrument at some point in another year. And students don't know this, and I found this out at a very, very young age, that we never want to use hot or boiling water, particularly on our rubber mouthpieces. It will distort the color. But if we're struggling to get lower notes out, that often means that we're not dropping our jaw. And so on the saxophone, dropping our jaw, loosening up the bottom lip, making sure this is loose and not firm, is really important for those low notes. And so changing from ta to t or tu to ta, you can even see in how I'm saying it, ta, forces me to drop the jaw and oftentimes will immediately help, particularly the younger musicians, to get the lower notes out. So from ta to ta, dropping the jaw, loosening that up. And then we also need to think about, as we start playing lower notes, we need to be putting more air into the horn.
This podcast is sponsored by FJM, Fred J. Miller Incorporated, found at fjminc.com. Hey everybody, this is Tim Hinton, the Beast of the Marching Arts, and we're talking all about saxophone today, and I have somebody that is a wonderful saxophone instructor and performer. Lori Schwartz Reichl is with me. Lori, how are you?
Fine. Thank you for having me, Tim.
I so appreciate you're going to share all of your best saxophone information with us. First off, would you start by introducing yourself, please?
Sure. I'm Dr. Lori Schwartz Reichl. I'm an author, educator, and speaker. And for 15 years, I was a middle school band director in Maryland and Pennsylvania. And for the last 9 years, I've been an author, educator, speaker, traveling with teachers and companies, helping them to grow and make key changes in their living and working situations. I pose questions for reflection and provide actionable key changes for us to grow together. Funny though, I've been a private saxophone teacher for 30 years. So I'm 46 and I started teaching when I was 16 years old because my father was my elementary and high school band director. And when he had me as, I believe, a junior in high school, he had a few young students that he didn't have time to fit into his schedule. So he said, Lori, would you like to start teaching some of the 4th and 5th grade saxophone students? So as a junior in high school, I started teaching, and then that moved on into collegiate teaching, and then high school, or middle school and high school. I also have a couple adults that I teach as well. So I do that on Thursdays. So that's the one music aspect that I keep every Thursdays from 3 to 9 for my private studio.
Well, I love that. Those are very lucky students, and how interesting that you started in high school. I would like to have a whole nother podcast conversation with you about having a dad who's your band director, but that's probably for another day. But for today, we're here to talk about the saxophone. So everybody, here is our premise, right? I'm a band director or an instructor standing in front of an ensemble. There sit some students with saxophones. What should I know to be most effective in trying to help them be better musicians and play better? So, Lori, what's the first thing that you would want me to know?
Well, and I had asked you this at the very beginning. I'll be talking about this generally from anyone from a beginner to a high school or collegiate or even professional player. The bulk of the students that I work with now are elementary, middle, and high school, and they range in, all different talents and abilities. I often will have students that come to me that have started performing or started to learn their instrument. So I'm getting them a few months in. But the very first thing we want to think about is their posture. So if they're sitting in front of us, how are they sitting in front of us? So for the saxophone, oftentimes the younger musicians will start with their bell off to the right side of their body. That's typical how we'll start teaching them. If they've been playing for a few years and as they are getting bigger, I will recommend that they may want to consider playing between their legs. And that's a little awkward sometimes for different students, depending on their gender, how they're identifying, what clothing they're wearing. So for me, as a female, identifying female, I will play between my legs if I'm wearing pants and I feel very comfortable. But if I'm wearing a skirt or a dress, I'll play off to the side. So the first thing we want to do is, where is the placement of the saxophone? And if it's off to the side, typically students will have, they'll slack back in their seat a little bit more, the younger students. So we want to think of, if it's off to the side, feet flat on the floor, their butt or their rear end halfway off the chair so that they're sitting on the edge of their seat, so their feet can be flat on the floor, particularly if they're a fourth or a fifth grader or beginning musician. Their feet might not even be long enough to touch the floor. So if they're halfway off the chair, feet flat on the floor, shoulders back. And then from there, we can go into placement of the rest of the accessories. So next thing we want to think about is their neck strap. So I have mine here. So if I put mine on really quickly, we want to think about having the neck strap up high enough so that when the instrument is in their mouth, the saxophone is coming directly into their mouth. So many times, particularly with younger musicians, I will see that the neck strap is all the way down. They don't even know sometimes that they can change that and change the height of the neck strap. And so the mouthpiece needs to come directly in. If they have to push, if their head comes down at all, then the neck strap is still too low. So it should be just very easy that the mouthpiece can come right to their mouth. They're not having to reach up for it or reach down. And so sometimes that takes several weeks until they can find a comfortable place for their mouthpiece. And that might change over time too. And if the mouthpiece is not right there in their mouth, that's going to affect their embouchure. So the neck strap is the most important thing from there. And then, we can go into talk about types of all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. No, I love that you started with this, because how many times do we see beginning sax players and they're like this? I mean, like they're bent over, they're reaching for the instrument. That's so interesting. And I don't know if that's just us not setting them up for success at the very beginning on how do you, but I think this is a point that makes perfect sense to my head, having been around a bunch of school kids playing sax.
And the smaller students, fourth, fifth, depending on what state you're in and when they start playing, off to the side is the most comfortable for them. They can't manage right in the middle of their body, but off to the side they can. But again, they have a tendency to kind of schlep back in their seat when that happens. And then the mouthpiece comes farther down. We have to think about the neck strap and so forth, and really think about that posture. And we have to readjust as they're playing too, because if they start to schlep back in their seat, the neck strap might start to fall down a little bit. We have to bring that back up. So many times, even in a 30-minute lesson, when I'm working with a student, I'm asking them to readjust their neck strap. Again, pull that up a little higher. Oh, you're sitting up taller now. Now you got to pull the neck strap up a little bit higher.
That's very interesting, because as you might want to move, that's all going to change. So I think being very aware of this is the point, right? Being very aware of them having the right mechanics of it all.
And you brought up a great point. For me, I usually will start with the student sitting, but when they stand, that's going to change too. So as someone stands up, the height of their neck strap may need to be adjusted too. Most of my lessons I do sitting, primarily for the younger kids. It's too much for them sometimes when they're standing, and the saxophone can rest against the right side of their leg. But that then takes us to, if we do move to playing between your legs, you then have to change your body. So you can't really tell here, but off to the side, the inside left side of the bell can rest against their right thigh. When we go to the middle of the body, I always teach my students, regardless of who they are or age, that their right thigh has to come farther out this way. And then the instrument can actually lean on their left inner thigh, because there's nothing on that left side of the saxophone. There aren't any keys that they can accidentally hit. There are on the right side, the low C, the low E flat, and so forth. So we get the right thigh out a little farther, and then they can rest the saxophone in their inner left thigh. And that helps them with balance too, particularly for the younger students, who, now this is only for alto saxophone. For tenor and bari sax, we would keep that off to the right side mostly.
Right. So if you are an accomplished saxophone player, it's not switching back and forth. It's just something you're used to and you feel like you can make it situational. It doesn't matter.
Right. And like I said, it's preference based. And for me, it happens to be how I'm dressed too. So if I'm sitting and I'm wearing a gown or a skirt, I'm playing off to the side. If I'm standing, I'm usually playing more to the middle of my body. Or if I'm wearing a pantsuit or pants, I might play in between my legs. And that's player preference.
Yeah, that's nice. You have that versatility, actually, with the way you can adjust the instrument. But the trick is neck strap, direction of the mouthpiece into the mouth, because as you said, that's going to affect the armature and everything.
Right.
I love it. Okay. So all right. So that's something very easy for any instructor or band director to sort of pay attention to: the posture, the neck strap, the placement of the instrument into the armature. That's something I feel like I could handle, right, even if I don't know anything about playing saxophone. Okay, good. What's the next thing you'd want to say?
Well, you also brought a great point about a band director, particularly someone who's not a saxophone expert. Because for me, trumpet, flute, those are not my primary instruments. I know them to a level that I could teach, an elementary, middle school, even a high school student. But we all have our primary instrument, and that's what we specify in, and we're great at. So we want to make sure, particularly our younger musicians or younger sax players, are they even putting the saxophone together properly? So, for example, if I show you mine over here, making sure that the neck is in all the way. I can't tell you how many times I will see young musicians where it's out like this and it's not in all the way, or these particular screws here are not snug. I like to use the word snug rather than tight, because I've seen times where the screws have been stripped because they feel like they have to, tighten it so much. So making sure the neck strap is in properly. That's, basically the main part of the saxophone there. And then also their mouthpiece. And, this is all about intonation, where they're in tune. Everybody's mouthpiece is going to be placed differently. Over time, we become, as more mature musicians, comfortable as to, okay, I'm usually well in tune if the mouthpiece is here. Maybe it needs to come out a little bit more and so forth. But for our younger musicians, let's get them started where the mouthpiece is on fine, and it's not, because if it's towards the edge here, it can start to get like a little shaky or it could fall off. So we want to make sure that it's in there. And then from there, we can go into intonation. Where should the mouthpiece be? Are we too sharp? Are we too flat? So checking, once we check the posture, we want to check, is this saxophone assembled correctly? And then another thing is, oddly, some students, I don't have my neck strap on, but some students young students will miss the neck strap hole. And instead of hooking it on here, they'll accidentally hook it onto a rod. Oh my gosh. And then something else is not working there. I can't tell you how many times I've seen that, where they just out of, they're haphazard, or they're doing it so fast and they don't even hook the neck strap on properly to the little ring there. It goes on somewhere else. So checking all of those things, and then checking posture.
Okay. Again, that's something I could handle, right? That's something that it's very easy for me to look for. And it seems so basic, but as you said, kids don't always pay attention. It's new, it's awkward. So making sure that's all correct. I love that. And then tip.
Every mouthpiece and ligature is different. And so a lot of the generic or student model saxophones will come with that generic mouthpiece and that really generic, thin, flimsy metal ligature. Sometimes the screws go above the mouthpiece. Sometimes the screws go below. You can see what I'm using right here. Mine go above and so forth. I use the O-leg ligature. I'm not promoting anything by any means. I always say whatever sounds great, whatever works for you, whatever you can afford, whatever you're comfortable with, whatever comes with your instrument. But whatever that is, making sure that that particular ligature is placed on properly on the mouthpiece, either if the screws go up above the mouthpiece or below the mouthpiece. And again, snug, making sure that those screws are snug, not tight, because those will also strip off and break. I can't tell you how many times I've seen students come to me, or I've been working as a guest conductor or a guest clinician, and they're missing a screw. Go to your music store or go to your band director or check your case, because it's probably in the case somewhere for that extra screw. And unfortunately, sometimes the screw will get broken and get stuck in there. Replace it with another ligature. We want to make sure that if the ligature has 2 screws, that both screws are always there, they're always in place, they're always snug.
You know, what I love about this whole conversation so far is we're really just trying to set them up for success from the very beginning. I mean, if your instrument's not put together correctly, if you're not holding it correctly, then good luck trying to make good sounds and all the rest of it with everything else you have to learn. So the basics of setting yourself up for success from the very beginning makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah. Several years ago, I put together a presentation that I have done at several Music Educators Association conferences and clinic events called Sax to the Max, bringing saxophone basics back. And it's so interesting when I am speaking to non-saxophone players. You know, oftentimes we will have teachers who teach both orchestra and band or even choir, and they might not even be an instrumentalist. They might be a vocalist, or they might be a string player and not a brass or woodwind player, you know, and it's all new to them and they have to teach all of these things. And they're saying, oh my gosh, like, you're right. Like, these are things I'm so concerned about, getting the instrument in their hand and getting them to produce a sound, that we often forget about. Is the instrument put together properly? Are they holding the instrument properly? How is their posture before you even think about producing a sound?
Right. And they're not going to get a good sound if their posture's off or their instrument's not put together right. Forget it, especially playing in tune and stuff. All right. I love it. Okay, good. Where do we go next?
Well, from there, we can go to, so we talked a little bit about mouthpiece. I'm not going to promote any particular brand, again, because we don't know what our students' needs are. You know, they may only be getting an instrument from the school and they can't afford to purchase anything. Okay, so be it. Whatever is there, that's what we're going to use. But we're going to make sure that those accessories are in great condition. So whatever mouthpiece you have, and obviously we're going to start off with a classical mouthpiece, the generic mouthpiece that's in the case, or a Selmer C-Star, whatever we end up playing for classical or concert band setting. We're going to make sure that that mouthpiece is not chipped or broken. And so I can't tell you how many times I will have students come to me and they'll be like, oh, you know, I noticed this little chip in the mouthpiece. Is this going to impact or affect my playing? Yes, it will. And so we want to make sure that that mouthpiece is in great condition. That mouthpiece is clean. So we want to make sure that it's been sanitized, particularly if somebody else had been using that instrument at some point in another year. And students don't know this, and I found this out at a very, very young age, that we never want to use hot or boiling water, particularly on our rubber mouthpieces. It will distort the color. So if you have, you know, a rubber mouthpiece and you put it under hot or boiling water, it will actually distort the color. It will start to turn lighter, in the black color will turn to more of a gray. It may even turn to a green. Lukewarm, even cold water is just fine. It's how you're cleaning the mouthpiece. And it can be as simple as antibacterial soap, hand soap that you use in your kitchen or in your bathroom, and just put a little bit of soap on there. Be very careful. Teach your students to be very careful to not accidentally drop that mouthpiece in the sink, because the tip of the mouthpiece is so fragile and it can break on the edge of a sink or on, you know, the faucet or on the floor. Get a Q-tip. You know, they sell these great accessories, cleaning packages, but really a Q-tip or a little tiny toothbrush will work just fine. And teach our students that if they play their instrument right after they eat, like let's say they come to you in the music classroom or in the band room rehearsal space right after lunch, to swoosh around some water, get some of those food particles out of their mouth if they can. If they're at home, they should brush their teeth before they play the saxophone, because those food particles can collect very easily and grossly inside of the mouthpiece. Just get a Q-tip in there, clean out the mouthpiece. For me, I'll show you a little bit. So you can see the top of my mouthpiece has a little bit of distortion on it. And one, that's because I wear lipstick a lot. So sometimes you'll see a little bit of lipstick on my reed. Some of the kids think it's blood. It's hilarious. I'm like, it's not blood. Or they'll see the lipstick on the top of the mouthpiece, and over time that will get crusted, and I need to clean that off. So for me, it's, makeup. For other students, particularly younger ones, it's food particles and so forth. And then that brings up a great point that we have to teach our musicians, particularly our woodwinds, because they're using a mouthpiece and a reed, that if they're sick, if they have strep throat or they've had a cough for some time, they should be replacing those reeds and washing those mouthpieces out right after they're sick, during the time that they're sick, because those germs can, really stay within the mouthpiece and on the reed.
Okay, this is all great and very practical advice. I love that. It's sort of like I learned at a certain point that if I wasn't getting over a cold, I probably needed a new toothbrush, right? Because that stuff is sort of living on there. So same concept here. A lot of band classes are right after lunch, and so cleaning that mouthpiece regularly seems like a great idea.
And then from there, we can talk about, we talked about placing the ligature on there, putting the reed on the tip of the mouthpiece as well. So what I teach my students is put the reed, and I'll show you here. And again, you've got a little bit of lipstick on mine, but make sure that the reed is at the very tip of the mouthpiece. It should not be going over the edge of the mouthpiece, and it should not be below. I tell my students that if you can see a lot of black or less than like a halo of a black or a little bit of line, then you're seeing way too much black, and that means that the reed is too low on the mouthpiece. So have the reed right up against the tip or just a little bit of black showing, and the reed should not be going over. Particularly with our younger musicians, that's one of the first things I'll look at. Where is the reed placement? If they're not getting a sound, maybe the reed is too low and they're losing that air because it's getting beyond the reed and in between the mouthpiece, or it's their tongue or their lip is getting stuck on the edge of the reed because it's beyond the edge of the mouthpiece.
Okay, more great advice. So again, setting yourself up for success. And these are things that anybody can know and understand, even if they're not a saxophone performer themselves. All right, great.
Oh, I'm sorry. I tell the students, take your time to place your reed on your mouthpiece. I mean, even with high school musicians, or if we're going back and forth from classical playing to jazz, if we're getting into middle school and we start having a classical mouthpiece and a jazz mouthpiece, or high school, do that with care. Make sure that you're setting the reed up properly. You're not rushed really quickly. If that reed is not placed well, like you said, you're not going to be able to produce a great sound. So take the time to set that up properly. Test it. I'll even have my younger students, blow into the mouthpiece just to make sure it works before they then put it on the saxophone, because once they put the mouthpiece on the saxophone, readjusting the reed and the ligature is often difficult on the horn. It's so much easier to do when it's right in their hand.
Yeah, great advice. I love that.
So the next thing we could talk about after we discuss posture, assembly of the instrument, setup of everything, would probably be sound production. And so again, I typically don't work with beginners. It's very little that I will do that. Usually they've come to me after they've produced a sound. Now, I'm often changing some things and adjusting some things. And their band directors always do such a great job to set them up. But if they're not a sax player, I'm tweaking things here or there. We're also often thinking about what sound we're using or saying. So a lot of times, and this goes back to probably elementary general music. My son was just doing this last night when he was singing ti-ti-ta, ti-ti-ta, and so forth, when he was talking about eighth notes and quarter notes. And we'll also think of saying like ta or tu or T into the instrument. And those are all great things to say. And sometimes they work wonderful for students. But what I have found, as particularly with the younger musicians, if they are struggling to get the lower notes out, and I'm talking even lower than G. So sometimes they will be able to comfortably get out B, A, and G. And then for some reason, dropping below G for some fourth and fifth graders can be very difficult. So maybe they're going to F sharp or F natural next or whatever. but I'm not even talking about like low C's or low B flats, but even below the G range, we may have to change what we're saying into the instrument. So ta or tu or ti, and you can tell even how my mouth is forming differently. Sometimes my corners of my mouth are going up. Sometimes they're protruding a little bit more forward. But if we're struggling to get lower notes out, that often means that we're not dropping our jaw. And so on the saxophone, dropping our jaw, loosening up the bottom lip, making sure this is loose and not firm is really important for those low notes. And so changing from ta to ti or tu to ta, you can even see in how I'm saying it, ta, forces me to drop the jaw and oftentimes will immediately help, particularly the younger musicians, to get the lower notes out. So from ta to ta, dropping the jaw, loosening that up. And then we also need to think about, as we start playing lower notes, we need to be putting more air into the horn. Some musicians think, oh, I can just blow the same amount of air, or I don't have to change anything with my embouchure or my corners of my mouth or my jaw. Total lie. On the saxophone, we have to adjust all of that. We need to be using more air for the lower notes, looser, and then the opposite. As we're going higher, we can firm our corners a little bit more. We can be blowing faster air. I even talk about, particularly when students are struggling with the palm keys on the left side, so high D, high E, high F, so forth, that they're even thinking about the direction of their air. If they are blowing in more of an upward direction, just thinking about where that airflow is going, sometimes that magically helps to get the palm keys out, palm key notes out.
Yeah, that's just really interesting. And that you will not be surprised that this was a major point when I spoke with the other woodwind players, is they talked a lot about that syllable, because the syllable that we often use to teach brass players is not necessarily the best one for a woodwind player to get the right sound. And I feel like saxophones have this unique ability to get all kinds of sounds, like really beautiful sounds, and then chainsaw sounds. And right. I think it's something about the instrument. So how do you talk to students about finding that wonderful, dark, rich sound that we love that a saxophone? I mean, I think saxophones are very versatile. I love when they sound a little edgy in a jazz piece or something. Like, they can make a lot of cool sounds, but if I'm in a symphonic band setting, for example, I want the darkest, richest sound possible. So how other than the syllable, is there anything else around that?
In addition to thinking about the sounds, and there's no right or wrong, like, don't be like, oh, Lori said that we have to use T or ta or T. No, whatever sound works for you in your teaching or for your students, and that could change as we differentiate instruction for each child, whatever works. But in addition to our jaw, our lips, our mouth, our corners, we also want to think about our placement of our teeth. And this can be really difficult with the younger musicians, particularly if they don't have all of their teeth, if they're not there, if they're going through braces. For the older students, the braces, it's not a huge thing with saxophone like it is for brass, but it can be. And it can also feel really weird. It can vibrate a little bit more. The inside of their lip or below their lip can get cut a little bit on the braces. But we want to think about the top teeth and where are we placing them? So many times, I'll go back to my mouthpiece again. So many times the students forget that the top teeth have to be on the mouthpiece. And sometimes we will see the little pads that you can place. Whatever, they're okay. But if you don't want to spend any money on that and you want to have something where they can dig their teeth into, a little bit of black electrical tape will work just great. You may have to put a couple layers of that on, though, if you need it to be a little thicker. But, they sell those black or clear pads, but you could also use electrical tape. And if you don't do that, still, their teeth need to be on the mouthpiece. What I find is you can go up to them. So let's pretend that this is, if I had someone here playing and the mouthpiece is on, I'll put it on. And they're playing. I say, pull up your lip so I can see, are your teeth on there? And they often will be when you look. But then as they pronounce the sound or they produce the sound, are they still keeping their teeth on the mouthpiece? The best tip I ever got from my sax teacher, Kurt Sipe, years and years ago was to just gently pull this neck part gently. You're not yanking it from their mouth. You don't want to do any damage. But if you just gently pull this as they're playing, if you can't move the neck from the mouth, then that means the mouthpiece is in place. The teeth are there. If you gently pull on this and it slides right out as they're playing, then they do not have their teeth on the mouthpiece. And so the teeth act as like a little clasp onto the mouthpiece. So use that trick to gently and slowly, and tell the students, because that will freak them out. I'm going to put my hand right on the edge of the neck as you're playing, blow a G or a low D or something. And I'm just going to, slowly pull that out. And if it slides, then their teeth are not on the mouthpiece properly. If it stays in place, their top teeth are on the top of the mouthpiece properly. And then from there, you can talk about corners and so forth.
Yeah. And so I feel like I remember, Lori, being a student, and I had wonderful sax players all around me in high school. But when I got to college, I heard the first amazingly beautiful, full, dark, rich saxophone sound. I'd never heard that sound from a saxophone before. And I was like, wow, the saxophone can do that. I was, no offense, but I didn't realize that kind of rich sound. For example, I listened to Branford Marsalis recordings because he has that sort of dark, rich, almost chocolatey sound that I, as a horn player, I love because it's very similar to our horn sound. So, listening to great recordings of great performers is a way for them to realize, oh, my instrument can sound like that too.
And the other thing, and this goes from teaching beginners, fundamental musicians to even advanced players. With the saxophone, a beautiful sound is a clear sound. And if it sounds spitty or fuzzy, it is not a beautiful sound. And that's not a clear sound. And that can happen from professional musicians to our beginner musicians. And that can be several different things. It could be like a lot of spit in our mouth. It could be that there's a little bit of spit caught between the reed and the mouthpiece. It could be that our mouth, our teeth, our embouchure is not placed properly on the mouthpiece. And it's as simple as vacuuming it out. I hate to use that word, suck, but vacuuming out the spit or the fuzz. I always say that, vacuum it out. Do that before an audition, before you play a scale, before you come back. If you have several measures that you're resting within a piece of music, you should be vacuuming out your spit. Even if you don't think you have a spitty or a fuzzy sound, do it just to ensure that that's there. And that is one of the greatest things for younger musicians. If we can get them to get rid of that spit or fuzz sound, and sometimes they don't even realize they're doing it. So like you said, listening to professional musicians, or I will demonstrate for them. Or if you have another student in your lesson group or your sectional group or your band that has a beautiful sound, have them demonstrate and play it and say, oh, listen to Tim as he plays the saxophone. Can you hear that Tim doesn't have any spit or fuzz? And they'll be like, sometimes they don't even notice it, but then you can say, now you play. Do you hear that? Or have them record themselves. This is what you sound like when you sound spitty or fuzzy. Now, let's vacuum that out. How do you sound now? Oh my gosh, that's a clear, beautiful sound. A clear sound is a beautiful sound. From there, we can get into that rich, dark sound that you're talking about.
Yeah, I love that. And, we were talking also about the fact that saxophones are very versatile in that, I remember as a horn player, often the saxophones would play along with us on certain lines, or they can play along with a lot, they play a lot with different instruments in all kinds of different ways.
Right. And that's something as a band director, and particularly when I go out and guest conduct for honor bands, I'm shocked at how sometimes I'll get the instrumentation and there might not be any horns, French horns, or they might be one or two. And I always give the benefit of the doubt to that particular instrument. So if a piece is written and the horns, the French horns, have the melodic line, they should be playing that line. However, if it's not heard in the audience or heard to you, the first person that's hearing it before the sound goes to the audience, then, and I've talked to composers about this over time, then we can find instrumentation that it's either written as, cues within the alto sax line, or I recently had this conversation actually with Brian Baumage just a few weeks ago, where we can rewrite those lines if it's missing and we need to have that sound happen. However, what you talked about is we want to match the timbre of that horn sound as best we can. And if we do have French horns playing and the alto saxes are helping them, maybe we don't need the whole alto sax section to be playing. Maybe it's just 3 musicians or 4 musicians or just a few. And we want to make sure that we tell our saxophones, listen, this line was originally written for the French horn. That's the sound that should be dominating, should be coming through. We are there to support them if it's not originally written in our music.
Right. And the same thing I'd say for like the low saxophones, like tenors and baries, are very helpful in supporting the low brass instruments. I mean, I certainly, when I write for marching band, I utilize tenors and baries very effectively in helping to support that low brass sound. And again, their tone needs to match that dark low brass sound. So do you tell them something specific about how to make sure they're matching that sound?
Listening is the biggest tool. So first we say, let's hear what that melodic line sounds like first. If we have, so for instance, if it's the alto saxes helping with the horn line, covering the horn line, whatever that's doing, let's hear what that sounds like first from the instrument that it was originally written for. So if we have a French horn player, we want to hear that first. Then how does it sound as we add one alto saxophone player to it? Now, what does it have? How does that line sound when we add a second, and so forth? And so we really need to make sure that our musicians are listening. We also, as directors, so I'll say, like, if I'm a guest conducting or if I'm the band director rather than the lesson teacher, how does it sound when we add additional voices? So like I said earlier, we may only need to add 3 or 4 of the alto sax players to that. And then I like to be very inclusive and very sharing. So if that's happening often, where we have the alto saxes helping or covering for particularly the French horn or another instrument, maybe in one part we're using the first 3 altos. And then maybe later we're utilizing alto saxophone player 4, 5, and 6. Or we're pairing the first alto sax player with the 4th or something. But making sure that out of fairness and a sense of inclusivity, if we have to utilize that we're utilizing as many of those saxophones as possible. And then that gives the opportunity for all of the saxophones to hear, how can we match? How is the timbre lining up? You talked about like the tenor saxes oftentimes will be, the tenor sax line is doubled sometimes with trombones, or I have used where I've lacked trombone players in a concert or a jazz band setting, where I may rewrite or ask the tenors to, again, help or support when that true low brass sound is not coming through.
Yeah, I love that. But I mean, the saxophone is really versatile in that way and can really support a lot of different parts of the band, as you said. So that's a big role for them to sort of step into, and they're going to have to really use their ears to, like you said, blend in and match those sounds so that we don't even know it's happening. Really, it's really cool.
Yeah.
How about, are there things like some of the woodwind players talk about a lot of alternate fingerings and stuff? Is there much of that going on with saxophones?
There is, like for instance, for B flat, there are several different ways that you could play B flat. The way that I often teach it or introduce it to new students would be the A with the bottom right bumper. And that's because, particularly if we're teaching the F major scale, so we're playing F natural, G, A, all we have to do is add the bumper key. We're already have the A fingering down. Let's add the bumper key. It gets a little weird, like if we could do 1 and 1 for B flat too. That's great, particularly if we're moving from D or from an F or something like that. And then there's also biz B flat, where we're holding down the B key with that particular key at the same time. So your finger is not on a pearl. It's in the middle of the 2 pearls. I always say, like, think about what note you're coming from and what note you're going to, and then experiment with those. And this is, I'm just referring to B flat here, but it could be for other fingerings too. Like you could have forked F sharp, different things. But what note are you coming from what note are you going to, and that should be determining what fingering you use, and then experiment with it, because what might be easier for me might not be for you. Things for like, what is the mechanism of their fingers? How are they maneuvering their fingers? So like when I was in 4th grade basketball, I jammed my middle finger. So my 3rd finger doesn't straighten out as well as my other ones. That one has a tendency to be a little slower. So with certain alternate fingerings, maybe for me, something might not work as well for me that might work for you, Tim, or another student better.
Okay, I love that. And then, of course, when we think about saxophones, we often think about them in jazz band and how important they are there. Is there anything about playing jazz music for saxophonists that I would need to know as an instructor that might, just any little tips or something that would be helpful for me to think about?
There's a lot of things. So in my particular, when I teach my private studio, I make sure that students are working on classical, jazz, ear chaining, improvisation, all of that. The best saxophone players can do it all. They don't have to do all of it well, but they are introduced to all of these categories of playing and genres and ways of playing. So the first thing that I say, from going from classical playing, and we can think of classical from even like concert band or wind ensemble or symphonic band, whatever you call your, ensemble at school. When we transition into jazz playing, we're often becoming the solo voice as a saxophone. In concert band or whatever setting you're playing at school, we don't often, as sax players, and particularly alto sax players, have the melodic line unless it's written for us. But in jazz band, we often carry the melody. And what directors sometimes will forget, or if they're not sax players and don't think about it, is we have to get those sax players to be more confident. I like to use the word spunky or sassy or funky in their playing. Let them let loose a little bit more with their playing. Let them play a little bit louder. Now, that shouldn't change their tone and their embouchure. That shouldn't change much with their posture. We might have in the jazz band setting, I know many of times I've had where the music stands are much lower. You can think of the big band style music stands, and that has a tendency to make the saxophone players kind of their shoulders, because they're looking down. And now me at 46 and having to wear reading glasses, that's even worse. But making sure that, if we're changing the stand height, we didn't even talk about that. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But if we're changing the stand height, that's going to affect oftentimes how close our musicians are to the music. We want to think about our posture as well. And so going back to our beginning musicians, we're thinking so much about posture and assembly and setup and production of the tone. When they start actually playing music that they're looking at, oh my goodness, make sure that the music stand is at a height that it's not then affecting their body. And it might be then, worsening their posture if it's too low. So raise that music stand up in your practicing routine. Raise that music stand up in your practice routine. And raise that music stand up in your ensemble setting enough that the musician can see their music and can see their director isn't hiding a device or anything behind the music stand. But the music is at a height and the stand is at a height that it's not impacting their posture at any means. So going back to the jazz, just let the saxophone players let loose a little bit more. Louder at certain times when appropriate, we should say. Funkier, sassy, just letting loose a little bit more. And that's oftentimes, even sometimes gender disparities. Oftentimes I will have girls or female identifying students in my studio who are often very timid sometimes. And I'm like, blow, girl, blow, get go, a little bit louder, and, depending on their personality, they might be more timid in how they're talking or how they're playing, but allow them the opportunity to really let loose and shine. And I'll tell you, it is the coolest feeling when that timid player or that girl who plays, a little bit more shy really starts to belt it out on the jazz. Man, it is the coolest feeling when they can then, wow, you're right. I do sound great. This is awesome.
Yeah, what a great opportunity for sax players. This is like a unique thing for them that they have this whole venue where they really are the star of the show. No offense, trumpets. And they really, you're right. They usually get that melody, and I love that for them. And it's a very versatile instrument that can do all kinds of things. So I love that. Okay, is there anything else we haven't talked about that you wanted to mention?
I think
have we covered it?
Sitting versus standing. And so like the standing will often come into play in a jazz band setting if we want the soloist to approach a mic or come to the front of the stage. So again, remember, we talked about this early on, you might need to adjust your neck strap, or you might need to encourage your students to adjust their neck strap from when they sit to when they stand. And in a private lesson or in a sectional, or outside, I mean, this is obvious with marching band, but in a concert setting, you might want to ask your students to stand for a little bit and then to sit, and that could be, maybe they can't sit with their feet flat on the floor and their backs aren't off the chair and their shoulders are back. So have them stand for a little bit, maybe move the saxophone more to the middle, adjust the neck strap, make sure that everything is in line here too. So we want to make sure the sitting versus standing, everything is in line there with posture, assembly, setup, production.
Okay, what practical, very clear information you shared, Lori. I really love that. If people want to learn more about what you're doing at Making Key Changes, where can they find all of that?
Sure, they can go directly to my website, makingkeychanges.com. I do a weekly podcast that comes out every Tuesday at 5 a.m. Not necessarily music related, but how can we make changes within even our classrooms to our living and working situations. I write a monthly article for the National Association for Music Education. It comes out the first Tuesday or Wednesday of every month. Sometimes it's music specific, sometimes it's program or classroom specific, and sometimes it's just how can we develop ourselves as professionals and humans. And then all the other work that I'm doing, a lot of guest conducting. Oftentimes I will have 4 or 5 guest conducting jobs per year. I will do some clinicking and adjudicating. Now that I'm more in the personal development space, I haven't been having as many music opportunities. I miss that. So I would love to be able to do a little bit more conducting and adjudicating, or an opportunity to work with teachers if they really want to specify sax placement. It's not a lot of the work that I'm doing as much anymore, but my gosh, I hope you can hear it in my voice. It's been a part of me since I was 16 years old. I can eat, breathe, and live playing the saxophone, and it comes so naturally to me.
Well, I love that you're doing all this great educational work on all different fronts for so many different people in so many different ways. So thank you for sharing your expertise in that way. Thank you for sharing your saxophone love and expertise with me today. This has been very, very helpful. I know everybody enjoyed these tips and information. So one last question, Laura, before I let you go.
Sure.
I've been asking this to everybody. Why do you love the saxophone? Why do you love playing the saxophone?
Well, can I share a quick story? So
Please.
I actually started playing the saxophone because the summer between 3rd to 4th grade, my mom's cousin Ellen donated it to my dad's band program. And so it sat in our music room, which was the 4th bedroom in our house, where my dad taught private lessons, mostly trombone and brass, but other lessons as well. And one summer I just went in there and tried to start putting it together. And I still remember what the case looks like. I remember how the case smelled because it was probably in her attic or something for some time. And my dad was like, if you want to learn how to play that, we're going to do it properly. And so he then started teaching me. And then by that point, he, passed me on to a sax teacher. But I just love it. And the versatility of it, being able to do classical and jazz. It's just become a part of me. I've made great friends, great, wonderful friendships and relationships from playing the saxophone, and met some wonderful people from doing it.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. And again, thank you for your work today. I really enjoyed it. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks for all the work that you're doing as well. Bravo to you.
Thank you. Make sure you watch for all the releases in this series, and we hope you'll subscribe here at YouTube so that you don't miss a single release. Thank you for watching.
Marching Arts Education is the home of the Marching Roundtable podcast. We give you access to the top marching arts professionals through live webinars, podcasts, videos, interviews, and online coursework. With over 1,000 podcasts and hundreds of webinars and videos, there are hours of great professional development for you and your staff. Sign up for a membership to Marching Arts Education to get complete access to all webinars, videos, and podcasts, plus discounts on coursework. Many directors are using professional development funds through their school or boosters to make these resources available to their staff. Imagine what you could do with so many great new ideas from the top professionals in our activity. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for our newsletter to find out about the latest podcasts, webinars, and new content. Find all of this and sign up at marchingartseducation.com.